The first things we chose not to forget, a quiet opening. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet makes the room feel softer and your thoughts less sharp, you are welcome to stay with us. Staying is simple. It asks nothing loud. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these nights to continue without interruption. Now rest. Nothing here needs urgency. This is only a slow walk backward into the moment when humans first decided what deserved to remain. The earliest images humans left behind were not ambitious. They were not grand statements about progress or dominance. They were marks made by tired hands at the end of ordinary days. The walls they chose were uneven, the light unreliable, the materials limited. And yet something in those early hours of expression feels unexpectedly deliberate. Not everything was drawn with the same care. Not everything was given the same attention. That difference matters. At first glance, the walls appear familiar. Animals move across stone with quick confidence. Their shapes are understood without explanation. A curve suggests a back. A line implies motion. These images are efficient. They do what they need to do and no more. They remind rather than explain. They belong to a world already known. Then there are the other figures. They interrupt the calm flow of familiarity. Taller than expected, proportions slightly wrong, heads shaped with more insistence than accuracy, bodies positioned in ways that feel intentional rather than casual. These are not sketches made in passing. They slow the eye. They ask for attention without demanding interpretation. The gentle irony here is easy to miss if you are not listening closely. Early humans lived surrounded by danger. Hunger was practical, weather was unforgiving. There was no reason to invest time in unnecessary detail. And yet someone chose to. Someone stood still longer than required and focused on shapes that did not belong to daily survival. That choice is more unsettling than any image itself. Late-night history prefers this kind of discomfort. It does not announce conclusions. It simply notices priorities. These early artists did not decorate their walls evenly. They were selective. Animals appear and move on. The unfamiliar lingers. It is adjusted, repeated, corrected, as if accuracy mattered more than beauty. You can almost hear the quiet discussion behind the images. Not dramatic debate, just small disagreements. The head was too small. The posture was wrong. The arms needed to be longer. The figure needed to feel closer to whatever memory was being held. This is not imagination spiraling outward. It is memory being stabilized. What makes this moment strange is not the presence of unusual figures. Human minds are creative. Strange images are expected. What is unexpected is restraint. Fantasy often exaggerates. It multiplies features. It grows elaborate. These figures do not. They reduce. They repeat the same elements again and again. Head shape, eye placement, stance. They behave like symbols built for recognition rather than spectacle. This is where the calm unease settles deeper. These images appear in places that had no contact with one another. Different climates, different animals, different daily concerns. And yet the unfamiliar figures are treated with similar seriousness. They are not decorative flourishes. They are inserted carefully into otherwise practical scenes, like notes written in the margins of a familiar routine. The humor here is quiet and slightly dry. These early communities did not invent farming yet, but they managed consistency. They did not measure land, but they measured memory. Somewhere between firelight and stone, humans decided that some things could not be left vague. Late night history lingers here because this is the beginning of documentation. Not writing, not record keeping in the modern sense, but intention. The understanding that certain experiences require structure if they are going to survive time. You draw carefully when you expect misunderstanding. You repeat when you expect forgetting. The figures do not dominate the walls. They coexist with the ordinary. This balance matters. They are not presented as constant presences. They appear as interruptions, events rather than environments. That suggests something brief but significant. Something that did not belong to everyday life but could not be dismissed as imagination either. It is tempting to search for meaning immediately, to ask what these figures represent. Late night history resists that urge. Meaning comes later. First comes behavior, and the behavior here is patient. The artists return to the same shapes. They refine them. They preserve them across generations. This is not casual creativity. It is continuity. Another small irony drifts through this moment. The earliest artists had no audience beyond their immediate circle. There was no promise of legacy, no assurance that anyone centuries later would care, and yet they behaved as if the future mattered, as if someone would need this image to remain legible long after the original memory faded. The walls themselves become collaborators. Uneven surfaces require adjustment. The artist adapts the figure to the stone rather than forcing perfection. That compromise gives the image a grounded quality. It belongs to the place it was made. Not an abstract idea, but a specific moment anchored in physical space. This is how memory becomes shared, not through explanation, but through repetition. You do not tell someone what happened. You show them how it looked, again and again, until the image stands on its own. Late night history notices something else quietly forming here. These images do not evolve quickly. They remain stable across long stretches of time. Change happens slowly, carefully, as if the original shape carries authority. That stability is unusual in early expression. It suggests respect rather than experimentation. Respect does not require fear. It requires attention, and attention is what these figures receive. Not reverence, not devotion, simply care. The kind of care you give to something you do not fully understand but refuse to misrepresent. The surrounding scenes continue as normal. Animals run, humans move, life continues. The figures do not disrupt the world, they exist alongside it. That coexistence feels deliberate. They are part of the story, but not the whole story. Late night history leans into this detail because it feels honest. Whatever these figures were, they were not treated as omnipresent forces. They were remembered moments. Encounters that left enough impression to be preserved, but not enough to dominate daily life. There is a softness to this realization. The past is not shouting at us. It is not demanding belief. It is simply showing us how memory behaves when it encounters something unfamiliar. It slows down. It clarifies. It repeats. As the firelight flickers and the stone cools, the artist steps back. The image remains, not perfect, not complete, but stable enough to survive time. That is all it needed to do. And now, much later, we stand quietly in front of it. Not to decode it fully, just to notice the care, the patience, the choice to draw one thing more clearly than everything else. That choice is the real story here. Before you drift any deeper, remember that nothing here needs resolution tonight. These walls were not asking for answers. They were asking not to forget. And in that quiet request, something human reaches across time and rests beside you. Parallel images across the world. Tassili, the figures that did not hurry. Before anything else settles in, there is a moment the night always gives you. A pause where the room feels larger than it should, and time loosens its grip just enough to let older thoughts wander through. If this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you are welcome to stay here. Nothing is urgent. Nothing needs proving. We are only watching old images surface slowly, the way stars appear when the sky stops pretending to be bright. High in what is now the Sahara, stone walls still hold traces of a world that no longer exists. Rivers once cut through the land. Animals moved where sand now drifts. People lived with weather instead of against it. They left behind images that feel familiar at first glance. Antelope mid-stride, hunters reduced to motion and intent, the usual grammar of survival. And then quietly, the grammar changes. Among the animals are figures that do not behave like the rest of the wall. They stand taller than expected. Their limbs stretch in ways that feel intentional rather than clumsy. Their heads are rounded and enclosed, not expressive, not personalized. Some appear to float slightly above the ground, as if weight was optional or simply ignored for the sake of accuracy. They do not chase anything. They do not work. They do not blend in. The first unsettling detail is not how strange they look. Humans are good at drawing strange things. The discomfort comes from how carefully they are drawn. The animals are efficient. A few lines and the message is clear. This is food, this is motion, this is familiar. The figures are different, their outlines are steady. Their proportions repeat across walls and shelters. Someone took time with them, someone corrected them. Late-night history pays attention to effort. Effort reveals priority. In tassili, the priority is not evenly distributed. The artist did not give everything the same level of care. They made choices, and those choices still sit on the stone, patient and unbothered by interpretation. There is a quiet irony in the contrast. The people who made these images depended on animals for survival. They understood them intimately. They knew how they moved and how they died. And yet those creatures are allowed to remain loose and shorthand. The unfamiliar figures receive discipline. This is not how fantasy usually behaves. Imagination tends to exaggerate what it does not know. These images do the opposite. They simplify, they stabilize. The heads are the most insistent detail. They are large and enclosed, drawn again and again with minimal variation. Faces are reduced or absent. Expression is not the goal. Recognition is. It is as if the artist is saying, "This is the important part. Do not change this. Everything else can drift." The bodies follow a similar logic. Limbs are elongated, not dramatically but consistently. The stance is upright and composed, no running, no collapse. The figures are not in motion like the animals. They are present, occupying space rather than reacting to it. Some early observers describe these figures with enthusiasm that leaned toward spectacle. Late-night history prefers restraint. The walls themselves suggest restraint. These are not scenes of panic or celebration. They are calm, almost administrative. Something appeared. It stood. It was recorded. What makes this difficult to dismiss is repetition. The same proportions appear across different shelters. The same head shape returns. The same posture persists. This is not one artist improvising. This is a shared visual agreement. Standards without rulers. Consistency without instruction manuals. You can imagine the quiet negotiations behind this agreement. Someone draws the figure too small. Someone else adjusts it. Someone erases and redraws the head slightly rounder. Not because it looks better, but because it feels closer. This is how memory gets refined. Not through inspiration, but through correction. The humor here is very dry. These people had no writing system yet, but they managed version control. They did not map their territory, but they standardized a form. Progress does not always arrive in the order we expect. The figures are often positioned near animals, but never confused with them. There is a boundary. The artists knew the difference between what belonged to the land and what did not. That distinction is quiet but firm. The unfamiliar does not replace the familiar. It interrupts it. Late-night history lingers on interruption. Interruptions leave traces. They alter routine just enough to be remembered. These figures do not dominate the walls. They appear occasionally like events rather than environments. That suggests rarity, not omnipresence. Something seen, not something lived with daily. Another subtle detail is restraint in decoration. The figures are not embellished. No excessive patterns, no dramatic gestures. The simplicity feels intentional. When something is difficult to explain, adding decoration only creates confusion. These artists chose clarity over drama. The floating appearance of some figures adds another layer of discomfort, but again, without spectacle. They are not soaring. They are simply not grounded. The space beneath their feet is left ambiguous. This is not an attempt to impress. It feels more like a factual inconvenience the artist did not bother to resolve. Late-night history resists the urge to fill that space with meaning. It simply notes that the artist did not correct it. The figure stands as it was remembered, even if it breaks expectation. That honesty matters. The environment around these images has changed dramatically. Grasslands became desert. Rivers disappeared. Animals moved elsewhere. The figures remain, not because they were important to survival, but because they were important to memory. That distinction is easy to overlook. Memory behaves differently than imagination. It returns to the same details. It refuses to improve them. It preserves awkwardness. These figures feel awkward in that specific way, not monstrous, not heroic, just slightly incompatible with everything else on the wall. The comparison with animals sharpens this point. The animals are drawn as needed, sometimes with energy, sometimes barely at all. Their forms vary, their proportions stretch or shrink, depending on space. Accuracy is flexible. With the figures, flexibility disappears. Late-night history enjoys this imbalance. It suggests intention without explanation, care without narrative. The artists did not leave captions, they left behavior, and behavior tells us that these shapes mattered enough to be handled carefully. It is tempting to imagine these figures as symbols. Symbols usually evolve. They accumulate meaning. They change with time. These figures resist that. They remain stubbornly consistent. That resistance is what makes them unsettling. The walls of Tassili do not ask you to believe anything. They do not invite you to marvel loudly. They simply present a choice made long ago. Some things could be drawn quickly, some things could not. As the firelight faded and the pigment dried, the figures stayed. Not perfect, not complete, but stable. That stability carried them across thousands of years of erosion and silence. Late-night history sits with that fact quietly. Whatever these figures represented, they were not treated as decoration, they were treated as reference. and references are drawn carefully even when the tools are crude. As the night deepens, the walls remain indifferent to our theories. They hold their shapes without explanation, and perhaps that is enough. Not answers, just evidence of attention. Evidence that long before systems and schedules, someone knew the difference between what could be left vague and what had to be remembered clearly. Wanjina, the faces that returned with the rain. Before the night settles too deeply, there is a small invitation worth accepting. If this quiet makes your thoughts slow down and your shoulders loosen without effort, you are welcome to stay. Nothing here needs defending or resolving. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these late hours to continue doing what they do best. Now rest. The rain will arrive in its own time. In the far north of Australia, long before roads or schedules, stone walls became calendars of memory. The land there does not rush. Seasons arrive with patience and leave with consequences. Water is never casual. When it comes, it reshapes everything. And carved into the rock faces that watch these cycles unfold are figures that seem to belong less to the ground than to the moment just before the sky changes its mind. The wanjina figures do not announce themselves dramatically. They do not burst from the stone. They simply appear, pale faces, dark eyes that take up more space than expression usually allows. No mouths. Heads surrounded by soft halos that suggest light or something close enough to be mistaken for it. Bodies simplified into calm shapes, often covered in patterns that feel more functional than decorative. At first glance, they seem almost gentle. There is no threat in their posture, no chase, no struggle. They stand as if waiting, which is unsettling in a way that does not demand fear. Waiting implies return. Waiting implies repetition. The most curious detail is not how they look, but what people do to them. These figures are not left alone. They are not abandoned to weather and time like most ancient images. They are repainted, carefully, repeatedly, often just before or during the rainy season, not as restoration for beauty, but as maintenance, as if letting the image fade would allow something else to fade with it. Late-night history enjoys this kind of quiet behavior more than bold claims. Repainting is effort. It requires time, materials, and agreement. Someone has to decide it matters, and that decision is made again and again across generations. There is a dry humor hiding here, if you look gently enough. These communities lived with floods, heat, insects, and uncertainty, yet they made room in their lives to touch up ancient faces on stone. Not because the rock demanded it, but because memory did. Priorities reveal themselves in small habits, not in speeches. The wanjina are closely tied to rain, but not in the simplistic sense of control or command. They are associated with the arrival of water, the reshaping of land, the return of balance. Their presence coincides with change rather than dominance. They do not rule the sky. They mark its behavior. This distinction matters. The figures are not drawn in action. They are not shown pouring water or gesturing dramatically. They exist as markers, as if their role was to be remembered at the moment when the world shifted from dry to alive again. Their faces tell the same story. No mouths, no speech, no instruction captured in stone. Whatever they represented did not require words, or perhaps words were considered unreliable compared to image. Silence leaves less room for distortion. The eyes are oversized, dark, and direct. They do not look at anything specific. They look outward, not toward the viewer exactly, but through them. As if focus itself was the point, it is difficult to read emotion into these faces, and that difficulty feels intentional. Emotion changes. Memory prefers stability. The halos around their heads are soft and unstructured, not sharp beams, not precise shapes, more like an outline of presence. The artist did not bother to explain what produced that glow. They only recorded that it was there. What is striking is how restrained everything remains. No excessive detail, no unnecessary flourishes. The figures are consistent across different sites, which suggests shared agreement rather than individual interpretation. Someone knew what needed to be included. Someone knew what could be left out. Late-night history lingers on that restraint because it resists spectacle. These images are not trying to impress. They are trying to remain recognizable. That is a very different goal. The practice of repainting adds another layer of quiet discomfort. Repainting does not preserve an exact original. It renews an idea. Each generation touches the same face, guided by memory rather than direct observation. The shape remains stable even as the hands change. This suggests that accuracy mattered more than authorship. There is a strange intimacy in that process. People who never saw the original event still felt responsible for maintaining its image, not because they fully understood it, but because forgetting felt riskier than remembering incorrectly. The connection to rain reinforces this logic. Rain erases tracks. It reshapes landscapes. It blurs boundaries. In a world where water can undo yesterday, images become anchors. You repaint what you do not want the rain to wash away entirely. Late-night history notices something else, quietly present. The wanjina figures do not multiply endlessly. They are not everywhere. They appear in specific places, often tied to particular rock formations and shelters. This suggests locality rather than universality. They belong to moments and locations, not abstract ideas. That specificity makes them harder to dismiss as generic symbols. Symbols tend to spread freely. These figures remain tied to land and season. They appear where rain matters most and where memory must negotiate with erosion. There is also a subtle inversion at work. In many early images around the world, humans are active and forces of nature are abstract. Here, the figures associated with rain are static, while humans move around them. It is as if agency has been redistributed quietly. The humor surfaces again in the practical implications. While modern systems rely on forecasts and instruments, these communities relied on painted faces that had to be maintained by hand, a kind of weather reminder that required pigment instead of numbers. Inefficient by modern standards, reliable by human ones. The absence of mouths remains one of the most persistent details. Without mouths, the figures cannot speak, they cannot argue, they cannot change their message. Whatever they conveyed was fixed enough to survive silence. Late-night history does not rush to define what that message was. It notices instead how the message behaved. It returned with the rain. It demanded upkeep. It tolerated no improvisation. As centuries passed, climates shifted, and people adapted. The figures stayed. Faces were refreshed. Patterns were renewed. The world changed around them, but their role remained oddly stable. This stability is what makes them unsettling in a calm way. Not threatening, just persistent. They do not explain themselves. They do not evolve into something easier to understand. They wait. In the end, the wanjina do not tell us what to believe. They show us what people chose to remember. In a landscape shaped by water and time, memory required care. It required repetition. It required agreement. As the night deepens, imagine the sound of rain approaching stone, not dramatic, just inevitable. Somewhere, hands prepare pigment, not to create something new, but to keep something old from disappearing. That choice echoes quietly across time, not loud enough to disturb sleep, just present enough to remind us that long before forecasts and calendars, humans found ways to negotiate with change by repainting the faces that returned when the sky decided it was time. Parallel figures across distant lands, when similar shapes refused to stay local. Before the night fully closes around the room, there is a familiar stillness that arrives without announcement. If this quiet eases your breathing and makes the world feel less urgent, you are welcome to remain here. Nothing is being proven tonight. Nothing needs defending. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these long hours to keep unfolding as they always have. Now rest. We are only following shapes that appear again and again, as if distance never quite mattered to them. Across Europe, North America, and South America, early images left on stone share an odd habit. They repeat themselves. Not exactly, not perfectly, but closely enough to feel uncomfortable. The landscapes are different. The animals change. The climates disagree entirely. And yet, among the familiar scenes of daily survival, certain figures appear with similar proportions, similar postures, and similar restraint. It is not dramatic. It is persistent. In the alpine valleys of what is now northern Italy, the rock carvings of Val Camonica cover entire slopes, thousands of images etched patiently into stone over centuries. There are hunters, animals, tools, and patterns that make sense within local life. Then there are the other figures, human-shaped but altered, heads rounded and enclosed, bodies upright and formal. Some appear to emit lines or rays from their heads. Others hold objects that do not clearly belong to hunting or farming. The carvings are orderly. Space is used intentionally. These figures are not scribbled into corners. They are placed where the eye will find them. And like elsewhere, they are rendered with more consistency than their surroundings. Animals vary. Humans vary. These figures remain oddly stable. Late-night history finds this stability suspicious, in the most polite way possible. Early artists were not constrained by rules. They could invent freely, and yet they chose repetition. That choice suggests agreement rather than impulse. Travel west across an ocean, and the pattern does not fade. Among the Hopi of North America, stories and images speak of beings that guided people through catastrophe and transition. Often described with elongated heads and unusual proportions, these figures are remembered not for how they ruled, but for how they led. Guidance rather than dominance. Movement rather than control. What stands out is how these figures are described physically. Tall, slender, distinct from ordinary humans. Their difference is not exaggerated for drama. It is stated calmly, as if difference itself was the point, not fear or wonder. In visual representations tied to these stories, the same restraint appears. The figures are not adorned with excess detail. Their form remains simple and recognizable. Again, recognition seems to matter more than decoration. Further south, in the caves and rock shelters of Brazil, similar scenes emerge. Small human figures stand beside larger beings with elongated limbs and oversized heads. The scale difference is unmistakable. The composition is clear. These are not metaphors buried in abstraction. They are spatial relationships, recorded plainly. The surrounding scenes show daily life, hunting, gathering, movement, and then the larger figures appear, often static, often central, often separated from activity. They do not participate, they are present. Late night history pauses here because presence without action is revealing. Artists usually draw what moves, what matters, what changes things. A figure that stands still yet earns space on the wall suggests interruption rather than routine. The humor surfaces quietly when these images are placed side by side. Europe, North America, South America, different hands, different tools, no contact, no shared visual language, and yet the same general design choices repeat. Large heads, upright posture, elongated bodies, minimal expression. It begins to feel like a shared character sheet without any record of collaboration. Of course, scholars often explain this through common human tendencies. People look at the sky. People imagine forces larger than themselves. People simplify the unfamiliar. All reasonable. And yet simplification usually leads to variation. These figures do not vary much. What is consistent is not just appearance but treatment. In all three regions, the figures are set apart from daily scenes. They are not woven into ordinary activity. They do not carry tools or hunt animals. They exist adjacent to life rather than within it. This separation feels intentional. It suggests that the artists were not trying to imagine themselves differently. They were recording something that felt external to normal experience. Late night history does not rush to name what that external presence was. It only notices how it was handled, with care, with repetition, with boundaries. Another subtle detail is scale. Scale is difficult to manage without measurement. Early art often struggles with proportion, and yet, in these images, scale difference is used consistently. The larger figures are not accidentally large. They are deliberately so. Size becomes a signal. The smaller human figures are drawn quickly and variably. Their forms stretch and compress depending on space. The larger figures maintain proportion. This inversion of care is quietly unsettling. It suggests that the unfamiliar demanded more discipline than the familiar. The absence of expressive faces repeats across regions. Eyes may be large, but mouths are often absent or minimized. Emotion is not the focus. Identity is. The figures are meant to be recognized, not empathized with. Late night history notices that when artists want to tell stories, they use gestures. When they want to preserve memory, they use structure. These figures lean toward structure. The recurring posture also matters, upright, balanced. Not aggressive, not submissive. A neutral stance that resists narrative interpretation. The figures are not doing something, they are being something. This makes them difficult to categorize. They are not heroes, not monsters, not ancestors drawn into daily life. They are interruptions rendered politely. The humor remains gentle and slightly ironic. Early communities without writing systems managed to preserve visual consistency across centuries, while modern societies struggle to keep design standards stable across decades. Progress has a strange sense of timing. Late-night history also notes what is missing. There is no escalation. These figures do not become more elaborate over time. They do not accumulate symbols. They do not evolve into grand myths visually. They remain stubbornly similar. Symbols usually grow, they attract meaning. These figures resist that gravity. They remain flat in the best sense of the word. Functional, referential. That resistance suggests a desire not to reinterpret, to keep the image close to an original impression. Even as generations pass, the shape remains. Across continents, the same decision appears to have been made independently. Whatever these figures represented, altering them felt risky. Better to keep them as they were. Late-night history sits quietly with that thought, not because it demands explanation, but because it reveals behavior. And behavior, more than stories, tends to survive time intact. The parallel figures of Europe, North America, and South America do not ask us to connect them into a single narrative. They only show us that human memory, when faced with certain experiences, behaves predictably. It slows down. It simplifies. It repeats. As the night deepens, imagine these images not as mysteries to solve, but as habits made visible. Habits of care, habits of restraint, habits of agreement across distance. The stone does not care if we understand. It holds what was given to it. And what it holds, quietly and patiently, is evidence that long before global maps or shared languages, humans across the world sometimes chose to draw the same kind of figure in the same careful way. Not because they copied each other, but because whatever interrupted their routines left a shape that felt important enough to keep unchanged. When images became architecture, when memory turned into stone, gobekli tepe, when stone learned to wait. Before the night sinks too deeply into silence, there is a moment when thought loosens its grip. The room feels wider. The past feels closer. If this quiet helps you breathe a little slower tonight, you are welcome to stay. Nothing here needs urgency. Nothing is being solved. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these long hours to keep unfolding without interruption. Now rest. We are only standing beside a hill that was never meant to look like a hill at all. Gobekli Tepe does not announce itself with drama. It sits quietly in southeastern Anatolia, a rounded rise that looks unremarkable until it does not. Beneath that earth lies stone arranged with intent long before farming became routine, long before villages settled into predictable shapes. This is the detail that causes a subtle discomfort. The structure does not fit where it appears in the story of human development. It arrives early, too early, and it arrives complete. Late-night history enjoys places like this because they refuse to behave. Gobekli Tepe was built by people who still moved with the seasons, people who did not rely on crops or permanent homes, people we often imagine carrying little more than tools and habits. And yet they organized labor, shaped massive stone pillars, and arranged them with precision into circular enclosures that feel less like shelters and more like stages. The pillars themselves stand upright like calm witnesses, tall, heavy, carefully carved. Many weigh more than 10 tons. Their surfaces are not rushed. Animals appear in relief. Foxes, boars, birds, snakes. Not decorative in a casual sense. They are placed deliberately, repeating across different enclosures. Patterns emerge slowly, not through imagination, but through consistency. The scale of effort is the first quiet shock. This was not survival architecture. You do not build this to stay dry. You do not carve stone of this size to cook food or store tools. Whatever motivated this work lived outside immediate necessity, and that alone disrupts comfortable assumptions. Late-night history pauses here because motivation matters more than technique. The tools used were simple by modern standards. Stone against stone, time instead of machinery. What is remarkable is not that it was built, but that it was worth building at all. Each enclosure forms a ring of pillars facing inward. At the center, two larger stones stand opposite each other. They resemble figures in the most restrained way. No faces, no expressions, just upright forms with arms carved along their sides, hands meeting near the front. They are not statues. They are shapes that suggest presence without insisting on identity. There is a quiet irony here. People who had not yet settled into permanent homes created something that feels more permanent than anything that followed for thousands of years. Temporary lives, enduring stone. Progress does not always move forward in straight lines. The carvings on the pillars are precise. The animals are not random. They appear again and again across the site, sometimes overlapping, sometimes isolated. The same species repeat in different enclosures. This repetition suggests planning, agreement, memory shared across time. Late-night history notices how controlled the imagery is. There is no clutter, no attempt to tell a linear story. The animals do not interact with each other. They exist as symbols or references without explanation. The stone does not guide interpretation. It simply holds. The arrangement of the site suggests coordination on a scale that nomadic groups are not supposed to manage. Hundreds of people may have been involved over generations. This implies organization without hierarchy as we understand it. Cooperation without permanent leadership. A system that left no written trace but carved itself into limestone. The humor emerges quietly when you imagine the logistics. Groups without settled agriculture gathering repeatedly to move stones heavier than modern vehicles. No carts, no draft animals, just coordination and patience. It feels almost like a rehearsal for civilization before civilization decided to exist. Another unsettling detail is what happened next. Gobekli Tepe was not abandoned through decay or disaster. It was buried deliberately. Tons of earth were placed carefully over the enclosures. The pillars were covered. The site was sealed. Late-night history lingers on that decision. Burial requires effort. The same people who raised the stones returned to hide them, not to destroy, to preserve, to remove them from daily use. This suggests closure rather than failure. Why bury something that took so much work to create? The question hangs quietly, unanswered. The act itself matters more than speculation. They did not leave it to erosion. They chose to end its visibility. The surrounding landscape offers no clear explanation. There is no evidence of conflict, no signs of collapse. The burial feels intentional and calm, as if the site had served its purpose. Late-night history resists filling that silence with certainty. Instead, it notices the pattern. Build with care, use with restraint, then cover and walk away. This is not how monuments usually behave. It is how rituals end, though we avoid that word here. It is how chapters close. The timing of Gobekli Tepe matters. It predates agriculture by centuries. This reverses a comfortable assumption. We often think stable food leads to complex thought. Here, complex thought seems to lead to gathering before stability exists. Perhaps the act of coming together created the need for farming later. Perhaps shared effort preceded shared fields. The stones suggest that humans learned to cooperate on large projects before they learned to stay put. Late-night history finds that idea quietly amusing. We usually imagine civilization emerging from necessity, but Gobekli Tepe feels unnecessary in the most deliberate way. It was not built because people had to. It was built because they chose to. The pillars themselves remain silent. They do not explain their purpose. They do not instruct. They do not commemorate individuals. There are no names, no claims of ownership. This absence feels intentional. In a world where survival was personal, Gobekli Tepe is oddly collective. It belongs to no one and everyone. The imagery is shared. The effort is shared. Even its burial is shared. The site does not fit neatly into categories. It is not a village, not a fortification, not a storage facility. It is architecture without obvious function. And that lack of function unsettles modern expectations more than any carving could. Late-night history appreciates structures that refuse to justify themselves. Gobekli Tepe does not argue for its existence. It simply exists. Or rather, it existed, then chose to disappear. The animals carved into the pillars look outward and inward simultaneously. Some face the center, some face away. Their arrangement feels balanced rather than expressive. Again, restraint dominates. The central pillars resemble figures but do not demand interpretation. They stand opposite each other like placeholders, not representations of people but of positions. This is where something stood. This is where something happened. No further explanation is offered. As centuries passed, the site remained buried. People moved on. Agriculture developed, villages grew, cities followed, and Gobekli Tepe stayed hidden, patient beneath the soil, indifferent to progress. Late-night history finds something unsettling in that patience. The site does not care about timelines. It waited until modern excavation stumbled upon it. It does not celebrate discovery. It simply reveals that our assumptions were incomplete. What Gobekli Tepe offers is not a message, but a correction. It reminds us that humans were capable of coordinated thought and shared purpose before they were comfortable, before they were settled, before they were predictable. As the night deepens, imagine the hill before it was a hill, stone rising from earth, hands shaping limestone under open sky. No permanent homes, no surplus grain, just people agreeing to build something that did not feed them. Then imagine those same people returning to cover it, layer by layer, sealing it away, not in fear, not in haste, with care. Late-night history sits quietly with that image, a structure built before it was needed, then buried before it was forgotten. A reminder that the past is not a straight line, but a series of choices that still wait beneath the surface. If this thought lingers as you rest, let it do so gently. Gobekli Tepe is not asking to be understood tonight. It is only asking to be noticed. Ziggurats, the architecture that refused to stay grounded. Before the night drifts too far inward, there is a gentle pause worth noticing, the kind that makes ceilings feel higher and clocks feel less convincing. If this quiet eases the weight of the day and lets your thoughts loosen without effort, you are welcome to stay here. Nothing is urgent. Nothing is being resolved. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these late hours to continue without interruption. Now rest. We are only following stone that insisted on pointing upward. In the broad river plains of ancient Mesopotamia, the land itself encouraged horizontality. Water spread wide and flat. Fields extended without interruption. Villages settled into low shapes that matched the terrain. And then, rising out of this deliberate flatness, came structures that seemed to disagree with the landscape entirely. Stepped platforms of earth and brick, stacked carefully, lifting mass upward where nothing else naturally rose. The ziggurat was not subtle. It did not blend in. It did not adapt to the land. It contradicted it. In a region defined by flood and sediment, People chose to pile material vertically, tier by tier, creating artificial hills that looked intentional from a distance and even more deliberate up close. Late-night history enjoys contradictions like this. Humans living in one of the flattest regions imaginable decided to build height, not because the land demanded it, but because memory did. Each ziggurat followed a recognizable pattern, a wide base, multiple receding levels, a staircase or ramp that forced the body to move upward slowly rather than rush. The ascent was controlled, measured. You could not approach the top casually. The architecture insisted on pace. What is striking is how consistent this design became across cities separated by time and distance. Different builders, different resources, similar shapes. This was not experimentation, this was agreement. The humor surfaces gently when you imagine the perspective of someone approaching one of these structures for the first time. A landscape of low buildings and open space suddenly interrupted by a massive stepped form pointing upward like an unsolicited suggestion, as if the builders were saying, "We know the land is flat, but we have decided to ignore that." Late-night history notices that this decision came with effort. Ziggurats required enormous labor, millions of bricks shaped, dried, stacked. Maintenance was constant. Rain eroded surfaces. Floods weakened foundations. These structures demanded attention long after their completion. You do not build something this demanding by accident, and you do not maintain it for centuries unless it continues to matter. The function of these structures has been debated endlessly, but late-night history prefers behavior over labels. People climbed them. People repaired them. People aligned cities around them. That tells us more than any surviving explanation. The ziggurat was not designed for comfort. The climb was exposed. The steps were steep. Shade was minimal. This was not a place meant for lingering crowds. It was a destination that required intention to reach. The upward movement itself mattered. It separated everyday ground from elevated space. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. Height creates distance. Distance creates focus. In a society where writing was still emerging, architecture became instruction. The shape told you how to move, where to look, when to slow down. The structure guided behavior without needing explanation. Late-night history finds something quietly amusing in this efficiency. Long before signage or rules, people used stone and brick to manage attention. The materials themselves reinforce the point. Unlike stone monuments elsewhere, many ziggurats were built from mud brick, impermanent, vulnerable. This required constant renewal. Each generation had to choose to keep the structure alive. That choice mattered. Rebuilding is not passive inheritance. It is active agreement. Someone had to decide that this shape still deserved effort. The repeated rebuilding also meant that ziggurats were never truly finished. They were processes rather than products. Layers added, repairs made, surfaces renewed. The structure evolved slowly while maintaining its essential form. This balance between change and stability is unsettling in a quiet way. The shape remained recognizable even as its substance was replaced. Memory outlasted material. The scale of ziggurats created a visual hierarchy within cities. They dominated sight lines, they oriented movement, streets and buildings aligned around them. Even when not approached directly, they influenced daily navigation. Late-night history notices how this kind of influence operates without force. No walls, no barriers, just presence. The structure did not need to command attention. It simply occupied it. there is also a practical irony worth appreciating. In a region prone to flooding, height offered safety. Elevated platforms protected what was placed above the waterline. Whether intentional or not, verticality solved problems horizontally oriented life could not. Yet the uppermost spaces were often small. The effort of building did not result in expansive usable areas at the top. This suggests that function alone does not explain the design. Something else justified the climb. Late-night history avoids naming that something. It simply observes that humans have long associated height with importance, not necessarily power. Importance. The effort required to reach a place changes how it is perceived. Climbing alters breathing. It slows conversation. It creates pauses. The body becomes aware of itself. That awareness transforms experience without requiring explanation. The stairs of a ziggurat forced this awareness deliberately, wide enough to walk, narrow enough to discourage crowds. Each step separated the climber from the ground below. The humor emerges again when considering how stubborn this design choice was. Across centuries of political change, the step tower remained. New rulers inherited old structures and chose to maintain them. Altering the shape would have been easier than preserving it. They did not. That persistence suggests the shape carried meaning beyond any single authority. It belonged to the city rather than its leaders. Late-night history also notes what is missing. Ziggurats do not commemorate individuals. There are no faces carved into their sides, no names etched into their bricks. The structure is impersonal by design. This anonymity reinforces the idea that the ziggurat was not about memory of people, but memory of position. A place where something happened. A point of reference rather than a narrative. The top of a ziggurat was often described as a meeting point between ground and sky. Without invoking belief, we can observe that elevation creates a physical separation that feels symbolic, whether intended or not. Standing high above the plain changes perspective. The city looks different. The river looks different. The horizon stretches. Height reframes understanding. Late-night history finds this reframing quietly powerful. It suggests that long before maps or measurements, humans used elevation to reorganize thought. The alignment of ziggurats within cities also matters. They were often oriented carefully, not randomly placed, their faces aligned with cardinal directions. This indicates planning beyond immediate utility. Orientation implies intention. Someone cared where the structure faced. Someone believed that direction mattered. The effort invested in orientation without obvious functional payoff is telling. It suggests that the structure was meant to relate not just to the city but to the wider environment. Late-night history sits with that idea gently. Humans have always tried to situate themselves within larger systems. When language is limited, architecture does the work. As centuries passed, some ziggurats fell into ruin, others were rebuilt. New cities adopted the same form. The stepped tower became a visual language understood across regions. Languages persist because they are useful. This one organized space. It organized attention. It organized memory. The upward shape did not need explanation. Anyone approaching it understood that something important lay above ground level. The structure communicated hierarchy without words. Late-night history appreciates how quietly effective this was. No instructions, no enforcement, just design. As the night deepens, imagine the silhouette of a ziggurat against a dark sky. Not dramatic, just present. A mass of geometry, interrupting flatness. Imagine climbing its steps slowly, the city receding behind you, the ground feeling less certain beneath your feet. Not because something waits at the top, but because the climb itself changes you. That change may have been the point all along. Ziggurats remind us that long before modern systems of control or explanation, humans used shape and effort to guide experience. They built upward not to escape the ground, but to reframe it. If that thought lingers as you rest, let it do so quietly. The ziggurat does not demand interpretation. It simply stands where the land did not ask it to, insisting gently that sometimes memory needs height in order to be seen. Break time equals 3.0 seconds, teotihuacan and puma punku, when precision appeared without permission. Before the night settles too deeply, there is a particular kind of silence that makes measurements feel unreliable. Distances soften, edges blur. If this quiet helps your thoughts slow down instead of scatter, you are welcome to stay. Nothing here needs proving. Nothing is trying to impress you. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these long hours to continue doing what they do best. Now rest. We are only walking through cities that seem to know how straight a line should be before anyone agreed on how to draw one. Teotihuacan rises from the Valley of Mexico with an indifference that feels deliberate. It is not hidden. It does not pretend to be accidental. Long avenues cut through the ground with unwavering confidence. Pyramids sit where geometry decided they belonged. Everything aligns, everything agrees. This is unsettling not because it is large, but because it is calm about being exact. The Avenue of the Dead runs straight for kilometers without apology. It does not curve to accommodate terrain. It does not adjust for convenience. It insists. Standing there, the sense is not of mystery, but of discipline. Someone decided where this line should go and then followed through, without compromise. Late-night history enjoys places like this because they refuse to behave like experiments. Teotihuacan does not feel like a city that grew. It feels like a city that was placed. Structures appear positioned rather than accumulated. Space is allocated with restraint. Nothing crowds. Nothing drifts. The pyramids themselves are massive, but their mass is controlled. Each layer recedes with intention. Angles repeat. Proportions hold steady. This is not improvisation in stone. This is planning that survived execution. What makes this quietly unsettling is the absence of obvious trial and error. In most early construction, mistakes remain visible. Walls shift, alignments wobble, adjustments reveal learning in progress. Teotihuacan hides its learning well. If mistakes were made, they were corrected before stone met ground. The materials used were heavy and uncooperative. Stone does not forgive hesitation, and yet the city maintains consistency across vast distances. This suggests coordination beyond individual skill, shared standards, agreed measurements. An understanding of straightness that did not rely on metal tools or modern surveying. Late-night history pauses here because precision requires more than talent. It requires consensus. Someone had to agree what straight meant, what level meant, what aligned meant. These decisions had to be shared across teams and generations. The humor surfaces quietly when you imagine the logistics. Thousands of people working without digital plans, without standardized rulers, without modern transport, yet producing a city that modern aerial photography still finds impressively obedient to geometry. It feels like the city was built with an overhead view that no one was supposed to have. Beneath the pyramids, tunnels, and chambers add another layer of discomfort. Sheets of mica line certain spaces, reflecting heat and light. Mica is not common locally. It was transported deliberately. Its placement suggests intention rather than decoration. Not visible, not ornamental, functional or symbolic in ways that remain understated. Late-night history does not rush to explain why. It only notes that effort was spent on things most people would never see. That choice suggests priorities we no longer share. Teotihuacan was not slowly abandoned through decay alone. Its core was left intact enough to remain legible centuries later. The city stopped being inhabited, but its shape was respected. People moved around it, they named it. They preserved its outline by not dismantling it entirely. That restraint matters. Ruins often become quarries. Teotihuacan remained something else. A reference point, a memory that did not require maintenance to retain authority. Now shift the night southward, across mountains and time, to Puma Punku. The discomfort deepens here, not because of scale, but because of finish. Puma Punku sits high near Lake Titicaca, where air thins and patience is tested by altitude alone. The stones here do not announce themselves with height. They announce themselves with edges, sharp, clean, repeated. These blocks are not large in the way pyramids are large. They are precise in the way machines are precise. Right angles meet without gaps. Grooves align perfectly across separate stones. Holes drilled straight through dense rock maintain consistent diameter and spacing. Late-night history enjoys understatement, but Puma Punku resists it slightly. The stones look less like architecture and more like components. They suggest assembly rather than stacking. Pieces that were meant to fit, not simply sit. The material itself is uncooperative. Andesite is hard, tough, resistant to casual shaping. Working it with simple stone tools would be exhausting and imprecise. And yet the finish remains smooth. The edges remain disciplined. The humor emerges gently here. These builders did not have a toolkit that modern engineers would recognize, yet they produced tolerances that modern engineers respect. Progress again refuses to arrive on schedule. What unsettles most is repetition. One precise stone could be dismissed as exceptional effort. Dozens of identical forms demand explanation of process. Consistency implies method. Method implies shared knowledge. Late-night history notices that the shapes repeat with such fidelity that they appear modular, as if the builders were thinking in terms of units rather than monuments. This is a different mindset than piling stones into impressive shapes. It suggests abstraction. The famous H-shaped blocks reinforce this feeling. Their design allows interlocking. Weight distributes evenly. Movement is restricted. These are solutions to engineering problems, not aesthetic ones. Yet there is no evidence of large-scale metal tools. No remains of advanced cutting devices. No clear traces of how such precision was achieved. The stones remain while the method does not. This absence creates the quiet unease, not mystery. Absence, a gap between result and explanation. Late-night history prefers to sit in that gap rather than fill it with speculation. The stones do not need fantasy to be unsettling. Their calm accuracy is enough. The site shows signs of intentional dismantling or interruption. Some stones are displaced. Others appear unfinished, as if work stopped not through chaos but through decision. The project did not collapse, it paused. This pause mirrors what we saw elsewhere. Build with care, achieve precision, then stop. Do not force completion for the sake of pride. Comparing Teotihuacan and Puma Punku reveals a shared attitude. Both prioritize alignment. Both exhibit restraint. Both suggest planning that extends beyond immediate needs. Yet they express this attitude differently. Teotihuacan thinks in vast geometry. Puma Punku thinks in exact components. One organizes space, the other organizes material. Late-night history finds this contrast quietly elegant. Different landscapes, different resources, same insistence on order. Neither site shows evidence of improvisation. This is perhaps the most unsettling detail. Humans are excellent improvisers. Early construction usually reflects that. Here, improvisation seems unwelcome. The absence of decorative excess reinforces this. Neither site indulges in unnecessary flourish. Ornamentation exists, but it does not override structure. Function leads, appearance follows. There is a subtle irony in how these places challenge modern assumptions. We often believe complexity emerges gradually. Trial and error, incremental improvement. These sites suggest that clarity sometimes appears fully formed. Not because people were superior, but because priorities were different. When precision matters, effort reorganizes itself around that demand. Late-night history also notices the silence left behind. Neither site left clear instructions, no manuals, no diagrams, just finished work. This forces later generations to infer method from result, which is always uncomfortable. It is easier to believe in lost knowledge than to accept that humans sometimes achieve clarity without leaving explanations. The cities do not ask to be admired. They do not celebrate themselves. They simply remain indifferent to theories. As the night deepens, imagine standing between these places in thought. A straight avenue stretching toward the horizon, a stone block fitting perfectly into another without resistance. No spectacle, no declaration, just quiet confidence. This confidence is what unsettles most. Not the size, not the age, the certainty. Teotihuacan and Puma Punku remind us that human capability does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it works quietly, precisely, and then disappears, leaving only results that refuse to explain themselves. If this thought lingers as you rest, let it do so gently. These places are not puzzles demanding solutions. They are reminders that the past was capable of discipline without documentation, coordination without instruction, and precision without permission. The stones remain patient. They have waited this long. They are not in a hurry. Repeating shapes without a meeting place, when memory chose familiar outlines. Before the night drifts too far inward, there is a gentle threshold worth noticing, the moment when the room feels quieter than it should, and the day finally stops asking questions. If this calm makes your breathing slow and your thoughts soften, you are welcome to stay. Nothing here demands certainty. Nothing is being concluded. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these late hours to keep unfolding at their own pace. Now rest. We are only gathering patterns that appeared without coordination and refused to disappear. Across distant landscapes and long stretches of time, early human expression shows a strange habit. Certain shapes return, not once, not accidentally, again and again. The repetition is not loud. It does not announce itself. It waits patiently until enough examples accumulate that ignoring them becomes slightly uncomfortable. The most persistent details are also the simplest. heads that are rounded rather than varied, eyes that are large and dark, sometimes too large for comfort, faces reduced to minimal features or left incomplete, bodies upright and elongated, posture neutral, expression restrained, light or radiating lines implied around the figure rather than explained. These elements appear in places that had no reason to agree. Different climates, different animals, different daily concerns, and yet the same visual shorthand keeps resurfacing as if memory itself favored a limited set of outlines. Late-night history finds this unsettling in a quiet way. Not because it suggests anything dramatic, but because repetition without contact challenges comfortable explanations. Similarities are expected. Precision is not. When humans imagine freely, variation tends to increase. Stories branch, details multiply, images drift. These figures do the opposite. They simplify, they stabilize. They repeat the same decisions about what matters visually. The round head appears so often that it begins to feel deliberate rather than anatomical. Human heads are not drawn this way consistently in early art. Animals are given more natural variation. The unfamiliar figures receive geometric consistency. This suggests a shift from observation to reference. The eyes are equally persistent. Large, dark, sometimes hollow. They dominate the face while the mouth disappears or becomes irrelevant. Expression is sacrificed in favor of presence. The figure is meant to be noticed rather than understood emotionally. Late-night history enjoys the irony here. Humans usually prioritize faces for expression, emotion, identity. These figures strip that away. What remains is recognition without intimacy. You know it when you see it, you do not converse with it. The suggestion of helmets or head coverings appears frequently, not detailed, not technical, simply implied. A boundary around the head that separates it from the body and from the surrounding space. The artist does not explain what the covering does, only that it exists. This is important. Explanation invites debate. Recording invites memory. These images behave like records. Light is another recurring detail. Sometimes radiating lines, sometimes halos, sometimes a glow suggested by contrast. The light is never dramatic. It does not overwhelm the figure. It outlines it gently, enough to signal difference, not enough to distract. Late-night history notices that the light rarely illuminates the environment. It belongs to the figure, not the world around it. This separation reinforces the sense that the figure does not originate from the same conditions as its surroundings. Movement between sky and ground appears again and again without spectacle. Figures descend, figures hover, figures stand just above the surface. The artist does not dramatize the motion. It is treated as a fact rather than an event. This restraint is key. If these images were meant to inspire awe or fear, exaggeration would be expected. Instead, the behavior is almost administrative. Something moved, something arrived. It was noted. The humor emerges gently when modern viewers recognize how familiar these shapes feel. Round heads, large eyes, enclosed bodies, a faint glow. It resembles the visual language of modern science fiction far more than it resembles the visual language of daily prehistoric life. And yet no one at the fire was binge-watching entertainment. There were no shared scripts, no collective storyboard. The similarity is coincidental only in the most technical sense. Late-night history appreciates this coincidence because it invites reflection without demanding belief. It reminds us that the human mind may default to certain shapes when describing the unfamiliar, or that the unfamiliar leaves similar impressions, regardless of who sees it. The key detail is consistency across unrelated contexts. The same visual choices appear whether the surrounding art focuses on hunting, farming, or ritual movement. The figures do not adapt stylistically to local themes. They maintain their own visual identity. This independence suggests that the figures were not inventions shaped by culture alone. They interrupt culture rather than reflect it. Another pattern emerges in how these figures are positioned. They are often central but not dominant. They occupy space without overwhelming it. They are present but not integrated. This balance feels intentional. Late-night history notes that humans are usually drawn interacting with each other. These figures rarely interact. They are observed, stood beside, pointed toward, rarely touched. Distance is maintained. Distance creates authority without aggression. The figure does not need to act. Its presence alone justifies attention. Scale reinforces this. The figures are often larger than surrounding humans, but not grotesquely so. The difference is noticeable, not monstrous, just enough to signal otherness. The repetition of scale suggests a remembered proportion rather than symbolic exaggeration. Too large would feel fantastical. Too small would feel familiar. The chosen size sits uncomfortably between. Late-night history finds this middle ground revealing. It suggests caution, a desire to remain accurate rather than impressive. Witness accounts in oral traditions often mirror this visual restraint. Descriptions emphasize form and behavior rather than narrative drama. Tall, quiet, different, arrived, left. The language is practical, not poetic. This alignment between image and witness style matters. It suggests a shared approach to memory. Focus on what can be described reliably. Avoid speculation. The idea of movement between sky and ground repeats without explanation, not flight as a spectacle, not descent as punishment, simply transition. The figure belongs to neither space fully. This liminality is consistent across regions. The figures are not residents of the land. They visit, they pass through, they do not settle. Late-night history pauses here because humans are excellent at myth-making, but myths usually anchor their characters somewhere. A mountain, a cave, a river. These figures resist anchoring. They remain transient. The tools and structures that appear alongside these figures often reflect the same attitude. Precision without ornament, alignment without flourish, care without excess. The same mindset seems to operate across media. This suggests that the figures were part of a broader experience rather than isolated images. They influenced how people thought about order, space, structure. The humor surfaces again when modern observers attempt to classify these patterns quickly. Labels rush in to fill silence. Ancient imagination, shared psychology, coincidence, all reasonable, none fully satisfying. Late-night history does not rush to replace one label with another. It simply notices behavior. When faced with something unfamiliar yet impactful, humans across the world responded in similar ways. They simplified, they repeated, they preserved. The persistence of these shapes across time suggests that they were not easily reinterpreted. Symbols usually evolve as meaning shifts. These figures resist evolution. They remain stubbornly consistent. That resistance implies a respect for an original impression. Altering it felt risky. Better to keep the outline stable even if understanding faded. Late-night history finds something deeply human in that choice. When understanding fails, memory becomes conservative. It holds what it can without embellishment. The figures are not celebrated, they are not condemned, they are not integrated into daily storytelling visually. They exist as references, reminders, interruptions. This neutrality is unsettling. Humans usually attach emotion to the unfamiliar. Fear, admiration, desire. These images remain emotionally flat. Flatness can indicate objectivity, or caution, or both. As these patterns accumulate across continents, the temptation to connect them into a single narrative grows strong. Late-night history resists that temptation gently. Narratives impose direction. These patterns prefer stillness. What matters is not whether the figures share an origin. What matters is that human memory behaved similarly when confronted with whatever inspired them. Round heads, large eyes, enclosed forms, light, movement between sky and ground. These elements were selected repeatedly because they captured something essential. Essential enough to preserve, simple enough to repeat, stable enough to transmit across generations. The irony is subtle and slightly amusing. Long before modern media standardized the look of the unfamiliar, humans independently arrived at similar visual conclusions, not through collaboration, but through response. Response to what remains unspoken. And perhaps that is the point. Late-night history is comfortable with that silence. The figures do not ask us to decide what they were. They only show us how they were remembered. As the night deepens, imagine these shapes not as puzzles, but as habits. Habits of caution, habits of restraint, habits of accuracy under uncertainty. The world changed. Landscapes shifted. Cultures rose and fell. The shapes stayed. Not because they explained everything, but because they explained just enough to be worth keeping. If this thought lingers as you rest, let it do so gently. Memory does not always tell stories. Sometimes it only keeps outlines, and sometimes those outlines are enough to remind us that long before agreement or explanation, humans across the world quietly chose to draw the unfamiliar in remarkably similar ways. The shape the mind repeats when meaning emerges from inside. Before the night settles into its deeper quiet, there is a small window where thoughts loosen their grip. The day steps back. The mind stops performing and starts wandering. If this calm makes the room feel safer and your breathing slower, you are welcome to stay. Nothing here needs certainty. Nothing is being defended. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these late hours to continue without interruption. Now rest. We are not looking outward tonight. We are turning inward toward the quiet habits of the human mind itself. One explanation for repeating ancient images does not require lost cities or forgotten technologies. It does not rely on visitors or vanished teachers. It begins much closer, inside the human mind, where certain shapes feel familiar before we know why. Long before writing or formal symbols, people shared something less visible, a tendency to imagine importance, using the same outlines again and again. Psychologists have long observed that humans do not invent meaning freely. We circle it. When faced with the unknown, the mind reaches for patterns that feel stable, not because they are correct, but because they are manageable. The unfamiliar is difficult to hold. The mind simplifies it until it can be remembered. Late-night history finds this explanation quietly persuasive, not because it solves everything, but because it explains restraint. The ancient figures carved and painted across continents are not elaborate fantasies. They are reduced forms. Heads become round, eyes grow large, bodies straighten, details fall away. What remains is not drama, but structure. This is how the mind behaves when it encounters something overwhelming. It does not multiply detail. It removes it. Fear exaggerates. Memory simplifies. The figures left on stone feel more like memory than imagination. There is a reason children across cultures draw people in similar ways. Large heads, simplified bodies, minimal faces. Not because they copy each other, but because the mind prioritizes what feels essential. The head matters more than the hands. The eyes matter more than the mouth. These choices happen before instruction. They arise naturally. Now imagine an adult mind encountering something unfamiliar and impactful, something that does not fit daily categories. The same process applies. The mind reduces complexity into a stable outline that can be stored and shared. What matters stays. What confuses fades. Late-night history notices that the recurring ancient figures follow this logic closely. They are not crowded with unnecessary elements. They are stripped down to presence. Head, eyes, upright posture. A suggestion of separation from the environment. These are not random choices. They are cognitive shortcuts. The idea of archetypes suggests that humans share inherited mental templates. Not images passed through teaching, but tendencies passed through experience. The mind reaches for certain shapes when trying to represent authority, otherness, or importance. Height signals significance. Upright posture signals control. Light signals distinction. This does not require agreement across cultures. It requires similarity across brains. And brains, for all their differences, share basic architecture. Late-night history enjoys the irony here. The same species that prides itself on creativity often returns to the same few shapes when under pressure. Freedom collapses into habit. Imagination reveals its limits. Consider the large eyes that appear so often. Eyes represent awareness, watching, knowing. A figure with oversized eyes feels attentive even without expression. It sees more than we do. That impression requires no story. The shape does the work. The absence of mouths is equally telling. Speech introduces complexity. Speech invites contradiction. A silent figure cannot argue or mislead. It simply exists. The mind often removes mouths from images meant to represent authority or permanence. Silence feels stable. Late-night history finds this quietly amusing. Humans distrust words enough to remove them from their most enduring images. The recurring suggestion of light around figures fits the same pattern. Light separates figure from background. It creates focus. The mind uses contrast to mark importance. The light does not need explanation, it only needs to exist. Even the idea of movement between sky and ground can be understood this way. Height has always represented distance from routine. The sky is unreachable, vast, indifferent. Placing important figures above ground level elevates them without explanation. The mind does not need physics. It needs distance. This psychological explanation does not deny that people saw or experienced something unusual. It simply suggests that whatever was experienced passed through the same mental filters everywhere. Those filters shaped how memory was preserved. Late-night history prefers this explanation because it accounts for similarity without coordination. No meetings, no shared language, just shared cognition. The restraint seen in ancient images aligns well with this view. Archetypal representations resist embellishment. Once the mind finds a stable form, it keeps it. Change introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty threatens memory. This explains why figures remain consistent across generations. Altering the shape would risk altering meaning. Better to repeat than to improve. Late-night history also notes that archetypes often appear during times of stress or transition, moments when existing categories fail. The mind responds by creating simplified representations that can be shared quickly. Many ancient images appear during periods of environmental change, shifting climates, new landscapes, unfamiliar challenges. In such moments, the mind reaches for stability. It creates anchors. The figures carved into stone may have served that role. Not explanations, but anchors. Something to point to when words failed. There is a subtle humor in realizing that our most mysterious ancient images may be the result of the mind trying to calm itself. Faced with the unknown, humans did what they still do. They simplified it until it could be held. Late-night history does not present this as a final answer. It presents it as a mirror. The same mind that invented stories also invented reduction. Both are survival strategies. Modern psychology shows that humans remember outlines better than details. Gist survives. Texture fades. Over time, memories become flatter, more symbolic, less specific. This process happens naturally. No intention required. Ancient images may reflect this process, frozen in time. Not first impressions, but remembered impressions. The final form memory settled on after repetition smoothed away uncertainty. This explains why these figures feel oddly familiar today. They align with the way our minds still reduce complexity. We recognize them not because we have seen them, but because we think like those who drew them. Late-night history appreciates this uncomfortable familiarity. It suggests continuity rather than mystery. We are not different minds looking back at strange ones. We are the same minds, still using the same shortcuts. The persistence of these shapes across continents then becomes less surprising. When different people reduce different experiences in similar ways, the results will look similar. Not identical, but close enough to feel intentional. This explanation also accounts for the emotional flatness of many figures. Archetypal images are not emotional. They are functional. They serve as reference points, not narratives. Narratives evolve. Archetypes persist. Late-night history finds something quietly reassuring here. It suggests that ancient people were not trying to confuse us. They were trying to remember clearly. And the tools available were mental before they were technological. The mind built templates long before cities were built. And those templates guided how experiences were preserved. This does not make the images less interesting. It makes them more human. As the night deepens, imagine the ancient artist not as a visionary, but as a careful observer. Someone who saw something that did not fit daily life and tried to hold on to it. They did not embellish, they did not dramatize, they reduced it until it could survive time. Late-night history sits gently with that image. A human mind doing what it has always done, searching for stability, creating familiar shapes to contain the unfamiliar. If this thought lingers as you rest, let it do so quietly. Archetypes do not shout, they repeat. And in their repetition, they reveal less about what was seen and more about how the human mind has always tried to make sense of the world when certainty slips out of reach. The civilization that slipped through the calendar, a quiet theory about what came before. Before the night sinks fully into its deeper register, there is a soft interval when the past feels unusually close. The room is still. The day has stopped demanding explanations. If this quiet makes your thoughts less sharp and your breathing more even, you are welcome to stay. Nothing here needs urgency. Nothing here needs certainty. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these long hours to continue unfolding without interruption. Now rest. We are only considering a possibility that history never fully learned how to schedule. There is an idea that refuses to disappear no matter how often it is set aside. The idea that human history did not begin where our timelines politely suggest it did. That before the stories we call ancient, there may have been something older. Not mythic, not magical, just inconveniently advanced and badly timed. Late-night history likes ideas that arrive late and leave quietly. This one does both. It does not announce itself in textbooks. It surfaces instead in awkward places, in structures that appear too early, in techniques that seem to arrive without practice, in moments where humanity appears to skip steps and no one remembers signing the permission slip. The theory suggests that before the last great period of global cold ended, there may have existed a complex human culture, not global in the modern sense, not industrial, but capable of coordination, measurement, navigation, and architecture, beyond what we expect from people who were still supposed to be figuring out basic survival. Then the climate changed. Ice retreated. Sea levels rose. Coastlines disappeared. And whatever had been built near water vanished with them. Not dramatically. Not all at once, just steadily. Like a tide that does not care what it erases. Late-night history appreciates how unsatisfying this sounds. There is no single collapse, no dramatic ending, just loss through accumulation. Flooded plains, drowned harbors, submerged settlements, a slow deletion that leaves little evidence and even less patience for speculation. What makes this idea persistent is not imagination, but timing. The end of the Ice Age was not gentle. Temperatures rose, glaciers melted, oceans expanded, entire landscapes changed shape. Human populations were forced inland. Migration was not optional. If there had been coastal societies with knowledge of astronomy, navigation, or stonework, their centers would now be underwater, and underwater archaeology is not exactly generous with answers. Late-night history enjoys the irony here. We search deserts and mountains for origins while much of the early shoreline sits quietly beneath the sea, waiting for better equipment and more curiosity. The idea does not require a lost empire ruling the world. It only requires pockets of advanced understanding, groups who learned certain things earlier than others, groups whose knowledge was not evenly distributed but highly specific. Imagine communities that understood seasonal cycles deeply, that could track stars well enough to navigate long distances, that had developed stone-shaping techniques through repetition and patience, not because they were superior, but because they had time. Time is the detail often overlooked. If human culture stretches back far enough, there is room for experimentation. Failures forgotten, successes refined. A slow accumulation of skill that leaves little trace once the context disappears. Late-night history notices that many ancient structures appear fully formed, not primitive versions leading to refined ones, but sudden arrivals of complexity, precise stonework, large-scale planning, sophisticated alignment. These do not necessarily imply external instruction. They imply inheritance, knowledge passed down rather than discovered on sight. If survivors of an earlier culture scattered inland as coastlines vanished, they would not rebuild their world exactly as it was. They would adapt. They would simplify. They would pass on fragments. Fragments are easier to remember than systems. A method for cutting stone, a way to align structures with the sky, a sense of proportion that feels right, even if the reason is forgotten. Late-night history finds this fragmentation quietly convincing. It explains why advanced techniques appear unevenly, why some cultures excel at architecture while others excel at agriculture or navigation. Knowledge does not spread evenly when survival takes priority. The humor emerges gently when modern people insist that innovation must follow a neat sequence. First simple tools, then complex ones, first small villages, then cities. History rarely behaves so politely. Imagine knowledge being treated like luggage during a disaster. You do not take everything. You take what you can carry, what seems essential, what you believe will be useful later. Mathematics fits, astronomy fits, stone shaping fits, writing might not. Metalwork might not. The result would be societies that appear strangely advanced in some areas and rudimentary in others. Late-night history appreciates how this matches the archaeological record uncomfortably well. The presence of early monumental construction before widespread farming becomes less puzzling. Gathering people around shared projects may have preceded stable food production rather than followed it. Cooperation before cultivation. The idea that agriculture was a consequence rather than a cause of complex society feels backward until you consider necessity. If people were already gathering for shared work, feeding that workforce becomes urgent. Late-night history enjoys reversing assumptions like this. It makes progress feel less inevitable and more improvisational. The lack of written records from this hypothetical earlier culture is not surprising. Writing does not survive water well. Coastal flooding is unforgiving to organic material. Stone endures. Wood does not. What survives tends to shape what we believe existed. Absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence far too easily. Late-night history prefers caution. The ocean has a long memory and a poor archive. The idea also explains why many ancient cultures attribute their knowledge to something earlier. Not because they were incapable of invention, but because they genuinely inherited techniques whose origins they did not witness. Inheritance without context creates reverence without understanding. You know it works. You do not know why. This can lead to careful preservation. Techniques repeated without alteration. Structures built according to rules whose reasons are no longer discussed. Late-night history notices how often this pattern appears. Precision maintained, long after explanation disappears. The notion of a lost civilization also explains why ancient cultures often emphasize renewal after catastrophe. Floods, fires, climate shifts, these events erase memory faster than they erase skill. Skills can be demonstrated. Stories cannot. Imagine survivors teaching stone cutting to inland communities, not as theory, as demonstration. Watch. Do it this way. Do not ask why. Just follow the shape. Over generations, the technique becomes tradition. The reason fades. The result remains. Late-night history finds this deeply human. We often use tools long after we forget who invented them. The skepticism toward this theory is understandable. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and this idea remains frustratingly hard to prove. But late-night history is not concerned with proof tonight. It is concerned with plausibility, with whether the idea fits the shape of the evidence we already have without forcing it. A civilization lost to rising seas is not extraordinary. It is expected. Humans favor water. Water erases. What is extraordinary is our confidence that nothing important happened before the records we happen to possess. The humor sharpens slightly here. We trust timelines built from what survived rather than what existed. It is like reconstructing a library by examining what floated. Late-night history enjoys this discomfort because it reminds us that history is not complete. It is curated by accident. The theory does not suggest global dominance or forgotten technology beyond comprehension. It suggests competence, planning, coordination, a level of understanding that could vanish without trace under the right conditions. That level is not unreachable. It is merely inconvenient. The idea also reframes ancient innovation. Instead of sudden brilliance, it becomes remembered competence. Instead of leaps forward, echoes. Late-night history finds something calming in this. It removes the pressure of genius. It replaces it with continuity. Humans did not suddenly become clever. They remained clever and lost context. The end of the Ice Age becomes not a beginning, but a filter. What passed through that filter shaped the world that followed. Some things did not make it, some did. The idea also explains why ancient cultures sometimes seem to know more than they should according to linear timelines, because knowledge does not always originate where it appears. It travels, it fragments, it settles unevenly. Late-night history does not ask you to accept this idea fully. It asks you to notice how often the past resists clean sequencing. The archaeological record is full of uncomfortable gaps, periods of sudden advancement, long pauses, lost techniques that reappear centuries later. These are not errors. They are reminders that human history is not a straight line. The lost civilization hypothesis does not replace established history. It complicates it. And late-night history prefers complication to certainty. As the night deepens, imagine the shoreline of the ancient world. Camps, boats, observatories built near water, stone markers aligned with the sky. Then imagine the water rising slowly, year by year, generation by generation. People move inland, they carry stories, skills, habits. They leave behind structures that will never be found. What remains are fragments, and fragments confuse those who expect wholes. Late-night history sits quietly with that image. Not a dramatic fall, just a long retreat. If this thought lingers as you rest, let it do so gently. The idea of a lost civilization is not about rewriting history. It is about admitting that the calendar may be missing pages. And missing pages do not require imagination to exist. They require time, water, and a species that has always preferred to live near the edge of both. Nothing here asks to be believed tonight. It only asks to be considered. that sometimes what came before did not disappear because it was inferior, but because it was in the wrong place when the world changed. The night does not judge that mistake. It simply lets the possibility remain quietly where it has always been. Good night.